speaker in flesh is Professor Reinhard Kratz from the Department of Theology of the Georg-August-Universität Göttingen. His teaching covers the Hebrew Bible, the Qumran Scroll, and related fields. He had the well-known Septuaginta Institute in Göttingen, as well as the Qumran Lexicon. Another major enterprise he is involved in is the Scripta Qumranica Electronica, in cooperation with the Tel Aviv University and the Israel Antiquities Authority, and many other projects. He will read a paper on where to put biblical, Torah-oriented Yahwism in the Achaemenid times. Please, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for this kind introduction, and thank you very much, Kratz, for the invitation to this conference. To be in Haifa, it's always good. I like to be in Haifa, and I'm very much honored to be part of this conference and give a paper here. Now, my paper is quite similar to what Karel van der Toorn yesterday gave us. It's a very simple one, a very elementary, and it's actually more simple and more elementary. He had two thoughts. I only have one thought I'm talking about. So we are competing in the elementary. Now, in this lecture, I would like, and this is following very well this lecture we heard from Israel Finkelstein from his archaeological perspective. In this lecture, I would like to address a fundamental methodological problem of our sources on Jewish history in Persian Achaemenid times, which is actually sufficiently well known, this problem, but somehow widely ignored in scholarship. Not of the scholars in this room, outside this room, of course. I do not have, and I will have to say, I do not have an answer, and I do not a solution to this problem. But I would like to strongly advocate that we do not continue to pretend that the problem does not exist, and that we instead name the limits of our knowledge and take these limits into account in our historical reconstruction. Otherwise, biblical scholarship, I'm afraid, simply makes a fool of itself in relation to other sciences, especially ancient historiography, and turns out to be a purely apologetic enterprise of theologians or followers of the Hebrew Bible. So the problem I want to talk about concerns the literary sources of the Persian Achaemenid period that have been incorporated into what we call the Hebrew Bible, and thus, for purely pragmatic reasons, can be called biblical sources. Help me. Have the full picture, and to go is then
you can go here. Or this one.
Okay. Biblical sources. Well, I mean, I'm well aware, and you're all well aware, that there was no Hebrew Bible in that time, but on purely pragmatic reasons, I'm continuing to talk about biblical sources. That means texts which were later incorporated in the Hebrew Bible. These are primarily the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah 1-8, the book of Esther, as well as parts of the book of Daniel, all books which explicitly speak about the Persians, the Persian time. Furthermore, one can include also Chronicles, 2nd Isaiah, which is Isaiah 40-55 or 40-66, and the prophet Malachi, which are usually dated also to Persian times. I will refrain here from other parts of the Hebrew Bible that for conceptual or linguistic reasons are also dated to late Babylonian, Persian, or early Hellenistic times, such as the so-called priestly source or priestly writing, late redactions in Torah and former prophets, late poetry in Psalms, and wisdom and prophecy, of course. However, the following remarks also apply to this kind of literature. Now, in scholarship, the literary biblical sources are used on an equal footing with archaeological and epigraphic evidence for the history of the two provinces of Samaria and Yehud, the Judean population, both in the land and in the diaspora, and of the religion, that is, Yahwism in or under Achaemenid Empire. It is true that the dating, authenticity, and historicity of the biblical sources are disputed in details, and we saw that in these conferences all the time. But the overall opinion in scholarship seems to be that these sources somehow are reliable, and in this way or the other reflect the or a reality in Achaemenid period. The problem is that, in fact, we do not know, and hardly anyone wonders, what reality the literary biblical sources depict. Or in other words, where the sources come from, who wrote them, from which perspective they were written, and thus for whom and for what they are actually representative. It is undisputed that these sources were written by professional scribes and intellectual elites who also could afford, by the way, the necessary material, means for writing such text. I think it was not that easy. I mean, people who are from day to night writing and studying and reading texts have to eat, and somebody has to earn something for getting food and so on. So where's the whole economy behind that writing? And also the scribal material was somehow expensive. So especially if you write on leather. I mean, this is an expensive material, as we know from Qumran. So it is undisputed that it comes from professional scribes, but and elites, also wealthy people who were able to afford this writing. However, who were these scribes? And where did the intellectual elites responsible for the biblical literature have their historical place? By the way, I find the idea, because we don't find anything in the land, in Judah, Yehud, to say, oh, it's coming from Egypt and Babylonian, it's also not very elegant. I mean, it's also a gap, a hole. We don't know where they should come from. So do we find them in Samarian or Judean, Persian-controlled administration? Do we find them at temples of Mount Gerizim or Jerusalem? Or do we find them in private scribal schools or scribal families? And for whom did they write this biblical literature? For the ruling political class and the elites in the provinces of Samaria and Yehud? For the priests or other officials at the temples in Yehud or Samaria or wherever? For the general population? Or just for fun, for themselves? In short, I want to raise the question, where do we have to put the Torah-centered biblical literature of the Hebrew Bible, and also the para-biblical literature which comes later, in its specific form of Yahwism, in the historical and social context of Judaism in the Achaemenid period? As far as I can see, this question was and still is not raised in scholarship very often yet, and earns particular reflection. And this is what I'm trying to do here, concentrating on Yahwism in the Achaemenid times and sources. So I come to the second point. What is Yahwism? What we are talking about if we are talking about Yahwism in Achaemenid times. And I start with Yahwism in the Hebrew Bible, more specifically with the writings and texts that speak about the Persian era or are usually dated to Persian times. What characterizes Yahwism in the set writings of the Hebrew Bible, and what is special about it? I cannot discuss everything in detail here, but I will simply recall 5 characteristics that I think are not controversial and are familiar to everyone. But I just want to, bring it back into our memory. So the first characteristic to mention here is, of course, the role of a specific God with the name Yahweh, Adonai. In the biblical sources speaking about the Persian period, he is very often referred to as the God of heaven, for example in Ezra 1:1, what we saw this morning. But it is clear and occasionally explicitly stated, also in Ezra 1:1, that it is the God of Israel who dwells in Jerusalem. He is considered not only the highest, but so especially in Isaiah 40 to 48, also the only God, beside whom there is or should be no other. Other gods are regarded as gods of the nations and defamed as idols and actually non-existent. Secondly, this one and only God, Adonai, has a particular close relationship with a certain nation, expressed in the covenant formula, I will be their God, they shall be my people, quoted in Zechariah and Genesis 17 and so on. This nation is called his people. That means the people of a God, of the God Adonai. And these people bear the name Israel, or Jacob Israel. Even though the biblical sources on the Persian period, or speaking on the Persian period, speak almost exclusively of Judah and Judeans, but those in the land and those are outside, said to have been in the Babylonian Gola and to have returned, they too are called Israel, or people of Israel. Occasionally, this is referred to as the people of the 12 tribes of Jacob, Israel, Jacob, Israel. Thirdly, the God Adonai and his people Israel are connected by a common history that goes back to the Exodus from Egypt, or as in Nehemiah 9, to the creation of heaven and earth and the election of Abraham. This history is a very specific history, a constructed, sacred history of the Hebrew Bible told in Torah and former prophets. It is often alluded to or recapitulated as in Ezra 9, in Nehemiah 1, Nehemiah 9, and also Daniel 9 and other texts. Fourthly, the sacred history that connects the God Adonai and his people Israel is consistently marked by sin and punishment. We heard in one talk this morning already about this idea of sin and punishment, more specifically the sin of the people against their God and the judgment of God on his people Israel. The criterion for this punishment is mostly the law of Moses, Torah Moshe, or something similar, at its commandments which the God Adonai gave to his people at Mount Sinai and instructed them to keep. The sin thus consists in the apostasy from the one and only God and from the law of Moses. The judgment consists in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the exile and deportation of the people among the nations. Another peculiarity of these biblical sources is that the fatal history of sin and punishment is said to have been ended by the grace of the God Adonai to his people Israel in the Persian era. We saw that this morning, Ezra 1. With Cyrus and the Persians, according to the sacred history of the biblical sources, the time of salvation begins or is promised. The return of the people from Babylon exile, the rebuilding of the temple, the reintroduction and application of the Mosaic law as that, the teaching and purification of the people, the rebuilding of the city and wall in Jerusalem, and the restoration of the political structure of the province of Yehud, and all this under the care of the Achaemenid kings, Cyrus, Darius, Artaxerxes, appointed by the god Adonai himself. And this leads me now to the fifth characteristic, namely the relationship of the god Adonai and his people to the nations. The other nations outside Israel are seen either as the epitome of idolatry or as enemies of Israel and instruments of God to punish his people. The other nations are either to be punished and destroyed, or they are to repent and join the people of Israel and its God Adonai at the end of the time. An exception, as mentioned, are the Persians and the dynastic line of the Achaemenids. This is a very interesting phenomenon because there is no oracle against the Persians in the Hebrew Bible. They are seen as appointed by God of heaven himself as so-called successors of the Davidic line for the salvation and for the protection of Israel only. Now these are the most important five characteristics of Yahwism in the literary sources of the Hebrew Bible that deal with the Persian period and possibly date from it or from somewhat later. However, these characteristics do not occur anywhere in the same way, never. The great exception is, for example, and they don't occur anywhere, so they don't occur everywhere, so I want to say. The great exception, for example, is the book of Esther, in which neither Adonai nor Israel are mentioned by name, and only in a few places do we find an indirect reference to the sacred history of the Hebrew Bible. The situation is similar when we analyze the biblical text in terms of a literary history and come across older traditions that have entered into the writings of the Hebrew Bible, such, for example, as the basic writing maybe of the Nehemiah memoir, or the correspondence of the building of the temple in Esdra 5-6, where, by the way, not the Bnei Hagolah, but the people in the land are building the temple. The oldest stages of the Daniel legends in Daniel 2-6 should also be mentioned here. So Esther and these older components of the Hebrew Bible open at least a window to a possible form of Yahwism that is not yet affected by the five biblical characteristics or features, and therefore does not exhibit the characteristics of biblical Yahwism. Rather, there seems to be also a form of Yahwism that is found also in epigraphic sources on Judaism in Achaemenid times, which are quite different. Therefore, my next point is the third point, Yahwism in the epigraphic sources. Yahwism in the epigraphic sources, in addition to the literary biblical sources, we are, in contrast to earlier historical phases, quite well informed about the provinces of Samaria and Yehud, as well as about Yahwism and Yahwis and Judeans in the Babylonian and Egyptian diaspora of the Persian and Hellenistic Roman periods. As we saw, not so much through archaeology, but by a wealth of epigraphic sources. The documents of Elephantine and Al-Yahudu, and some small epigraphic finds, evidence such as seals, bulla, and coins, the Samaria papyri of Wadi Dalie, the inscriptions from Mount Gerizim, and last but not least, the Dead Sea Scrolls. These sources, as far as they originate from the Achaemenid period, already have been sufficiently discussed, or most of them discussed in this conference. And therefore, I do not have to and cannot go into them in detail here, but I would only like to examine whether the five characteristics of biblical Yahwism listed above can be found in these sources. And the answer, you know that. The answer is a clear no. Among the wealth of the epigraphic sources, only the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of the inscriptions from Gerizim, the late inscriptions from Gerizim, both coming from Hellenistic Roman period, contain evidence of these features of the biblical, of Yahwism, of the biblical sources, and contain evidence of biblical and para-biblical literature at all. The sources from the Achaemenid period, that means the epigraphic finds in Samaria and Yehud, as well as the two archives of Elephantine, wider archive in a wider sense of Elephantine and Al-Yahudu, text depots of Elephantine and Al-Yahudu on the other hand, do not reveal any knowledge or references of this literature, which eventually became the Hebrew Bible, and so the 5 characteristics of biblical Yahwism are also unknown to the epigraphic sources from Achaemenid times. So let me briefly review these 5 characteristics I named before. The epigraphic sources do indeed also speak of Adonai, Yahweh, Yahu, or however you spell it, as the God of heaven. We heard that yesterday, who in Ostraka of Elephantine bears also the title Adonai Tzebaot, also used in the Hebrew Bible. This God is without doubt the main God of the Judeans on Elephantine and in Al-Yahudu, as can be seen from the onomasticon and other direct witnesses. But in religious and legal practice, he is not, as far as we can see, the one and the only God for the Judeans on Elephantine and in Al-Yahudu. And in no place he is called the God of Israel. Second, there is no mention of a people called Israel or Jacob Israel. The self-designation of the Yahwist is Judeans, and this only at Elephantine, Arameans. These are also nowhere referred to as the people of the God Adonai, which would be in close covenant relationship with their God. Nowhere in the relevant epigraphic sources from Achaemenid times does the idea of sin and punishment, an offense against his own deity, and a divine judgment occur. The Torah of Moses is not mentioned, not even in the so-called Passover letter from Elephantine. We talked yesterday about it. The destruction of the temple at Elephantine by local Egyptians in conjunction with a Persian officer is lamented and accomplished by mourning rites, fasting, similar also known from the Hebrew Bible, of course. But the event is not interpreted as God's judgment on his people for apostasy and transgression of the Torah, Moshe. Nor does the rebuilding of the temple and the celebration of the feast take place with reference to the prescriptions of the law of Moses, as we find it in Ezra, Nehemiah. Nowhere in the epigraphic sources is there any allusion or recapitulation of the sacred history of the Hebrew Bible. The only historical reminiscence in the Elephantine papyri, I remember, is the reference to the conquest of Egypt by Cambyses and his handling of Egyptian sanctuaries as distinct from the Yahoo temple of the Judeans on Elephantine. By the way, also a very polemic statement, because we know actually that Cambyses didn't destroy all the temples of Egyptians. This is just a lie. But it was, it was fabricating history. But history, recent history under Cambyses, and that was reasonable, not the sacred history coming from Exodus or whatever. Finally, nowhere in the epigraphic sources does the biblical view of the other nations as idol worshippers and enemies facing their destruction occur. The Persians are accepted as the ruling political class. The indigenous population in Egypt or Babylonia is accepted as the ruling social class, with whom one comes to terms politically, legally, and administratively. With other ethnic groups stationed at Elephantine or settled in the area of Al-Yahudu, there are occasional legal disputes or struggles, including the conflict of the destruction of the temple by the neighboring priests on Elephantine, but otherwise the Judeans live peacefully with their other ethnic groups in the diaspora as well as in the country, do business, conclude treaties, fraternize with them. This also includes, in contrast to the ideology of Ezra and Nehemiah, the mixed marriages as well as oaths or contracts in the name of gods of other nations and other ethnic groups. So after all, we can say there is no doubt that we are dealing with Yahwists in the epigraphic sources. They are Judeans with a distinct Judean identity, partly also with specifically Judean customs and legal provisions. So some of the legal rulings in the documents can be seen or interpreted at least as Judean, specific Judean rulings. They apparently worship the god, we say Adonai, Yahweh, Yahu, as the main national god, though not as the only god, and live and arrange themselves in a multinational and multi-religious environment shaped by the Achaemenid political and administrative class, the indigenous population, and other ethnic groups and their cultures. So this leads me to the question of the explanation of this evidence. The evidence of the sources is crystal clear and leaves no room for doubt. Quite obviously, we are dealing with two fundamentally different forms of Yahwism in Achaemenid period, in the literary, biblical sources on the one hand, and the epigraphic sources on the other. While the historical and sociological location of the epigraphic sources, in most cases, is clear from the sources from themselves or from the archaeological context in which they were found, the historical and sociological context of the literary, biblical sources is just unknown. Now, how does scholarship deal with this state of affairs? Well, most colleagues, again, not in this room, of course, follow, some completely, others with some historical critical reservations, the narrative of the biblical sources. Or say at least, if this is all fictional, it's not historic, but this is the way how Judeans, by the way, the texts talk about Israelites and Israel, how Judeans see themselves. All the Judeans see themselves, this is expressed in the sources. So as far as the evidence of the epigraphic sources is concerned, they either, these colleagues, ignore it or declare it to be an exception or some marginal phenomenon which somehow coincides with the narrative of the biblical text. Characteristic of this position is, for example, the heading in a recent German textbook of the history of Israel and Judah, in which the chapter on the Achaemenid period is entitled History of Israel in the Persian Period. The subject of the account here is the biblical Israel. Biblical Yahwism then naturally also serves as a yardstick for the history of religion. The fact that neither is documented in any epigraphic source is mentioned in this textbook. By the way, Elephantine is dealt with in the Babylonian period, but it plays no role in the reconstruction of a historical events and the religious historical situation. To be quite honest, even if this is the usual view and represents the consensus in scholarship, in my opinion, it no longer has anything to do with science. The strategy for holding on the view of the literary biblical sources essentially consists of leveling the historical and social impact of the evidence of the epigraphic sources. Thus, scholars emphasize the fact that the most important epigraphic sources do not come from the land, but from the diaspora. That means from peripheral areas. such as Elephantine and Al-Yahudu. Here it is argued people either held on to old, outdated ideas on the monarchic period or adapted to foreign environment syncretism. In addition, scholars argue that Yahwism in the epigraphic sources is the popular religion, so-called, as we say in German, the Volksreligion, while the biblical sources are witnesses of the political and cultural elites, the so-called literati, who are considered more representative or more important for the course of religious history, which I would doubt. And finally, an argument of genre is also put forward by some scholars. Since the documents of Elephantine and Al-Yahudu are of purely administrative nature, they claim that a comparison with the literary text of the Hebrew Bible is not possible at all anyway. The fact that there is no reference to the Hebrew Bible in the epigraphic sources is thus just justified by the genre and considered as an argumentum e silentio, so silence. Now, however, none of these arguments stand up to closer scrutiny. As far as the location of the source is concerned, it is clear from Elephantine that Judeans in the Egyptian diaspora were in close contact with their own people and the Persian administration in the provinces of Samaria and Yehud. Thus, Elephantine is not a forgotten place on the edge of the world. Moreover, also few epigraphic sources have been found in the country itself. They are certainly speaking and are in accordance with the documents from Elephantine and Al-Yahudu. The distinction between the religion of the elites, the literati on the one hand, and that of the general population on the other, does not hold water either. In the documents from Elephantine and Al-Yahudu, we find very different groups of the Judean population, some of whom seem to have been very highly placed socially. It is rather unlikely that there were no literati among them and or among the scribes of the documents. And after all, two literary documents have been found in Elephantine: the Aramaic Achika and the Aramaic version of the Bisutun inscription. So we have literary documentation for these societies, which are undoubtedly the work of literati. In addition, the two literary works, Achika and Bisutun inscription, also speak against the argument of genre and the assumption of an argumentum e silentio. At least these two writings, as well, by the way, as the correspondence about the destruction and rebuilding of the temple of Yahweh from Elephantine, offer sufficient points of comparison with our literature of the Hebrew Bible, especially the correspondence relating to the destruction and rebuilding of the temple, and also the person of Hananiah, this ambassador. These are 2 points of context we can really directly compare to what we read for the land in Ezra and Nehemiah, and the differences are obvious. If we take only these few literary witnesses, it is evident that we are dealing here and there with 2 different expressions of Yahwism and Judaism. The same is also evident from the onomasticon and the administrative sources. As Gard Graneröd has shown for Elephantine and Teror Alstoy for Al-Yahudu, the outlines of an ethnic identity of the Judean community and the religion of this Judean community can be reconstructed relatively completely from these documents. There is thus nothing to prevent a comparison of the ethnic identity and specific form of Yahwism in the epigraphic sources with the identity and Yahwism of the literary biblical sources. Both forms of Yahwism move on a comparable level, but are fundamentally different, whereby one form can be clearly classified historically and sociologically, the other hangs somehow in the air. Now I come to my 5th and last slide, a conclusion what can we say and how should we proceed? In conclusion, the question remains. It is a question, and maybe you can give me the answer. What can we do with these findings? What can we say and how should we proceed in the historical reconstruction of Yahwism in the Achaemenid times? As I said at the outset, I have no answer to the question of where the biblical, Torah-centered Yahwism of the Hebrew Bible should be placed historically and sociologically or geographically. But there is no one who knows the answer to this question. And that is why I would like to promote a rethinking and a more consistent methodological approach. We need to stop pretending, I would say, that's my opinion, to stop pretending that we know the answer and treating the literary biblical sources as if they were more or less equal to or even superior to the archaeological and epigraphic sources, just because they offer more information and they offer, unlike the archaeological and epigraphic sources who are just mosaic stones, they offer and provide a nice historiographical narrative. That is why we like them. They give us a narrative. By the way, if you look at this 200, 300 years Achaemenid period, these are 3 events told for 300 years. And we have the impression, Ezra and Nehemiah, that's the Persian period and the narrative for this period. 3 events. And they are debatable. So rather we should, as it's actually customary in historiography and also is practiced for other regions and other ethnic groups, such as the Arameans, Phoenicians, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, and of course by all scholars in this room, we use the archaeological and epigraphic sources as a starting point for the historical reconstruction of the history of Judaism and Yahwism in Achaemenid times, and take the picture that emerges from this as a historical blueprint for everything else. Only in a second step, I think, one can, or should the literary biblical sources then examine to see if anything there fits somehow in the picture gained on the basis of the archaeological and epigraphic evidence. At the same time, the fundamental differences to these sources in regard to the history of Judeans and Yahwism should be not forgotten and worked out and observed in order not to contaminate the sources with each other in an inadmissible way and appreciate the literary biblical sources in their historical distinctiveness. So if they speak of Israel, take the book of Ezekiel, dated to 597, 587, speaking of the Beit Yisrael, the house, what do they mean actually? I have no idea what he is speaking about, Beit Yisrael. If he is talking to Judeans, I have no idea. So we shouldn't take them and say, okay, yeah, that's the biblical terminology. They are talking about Judeans. Now we compare it with the evidence in Judah and Yehud. This is not fair to the biblical sources because they don't talk about Judah, or they talk about Judah as if it was Israel. So we shouldn't forget this distinctiveness. So where the biblical sources have their historical and sociological place, who actually is responsible for them, so writing them, for the authorship, and in which circles of the Judean population they circulated, I can, as I said, no more answer than anyone else. What can be said, however, is this, that the specific Yahwism we find in the Hebrew Bible cannot have been very widespread in the land or in the diaspora. It is a historical phenomenon too, but it cannot be widespread. Otherwise, some reference to it in the epigraphic sources would be expected, but there is none. This is not an argumentum e silentio, but is confirmed by later archaeological and epigraphic evidence. As recently shown by Jonathan Adler, who is, I think, in the room, or was in the room, and his study on the origins of Judaism, the archaeological evidence for the dissemination and observance of the Torah of Moses does not begin until the 2nd century BCE. The same is the case with the epigraphic sources found at Qumran. This confirms the conclusion that the absence of references to Yahwism of the Hebrew Bible in the archaeological and epigraphic sources of the Persian and early Hellenistic period is not due to the coincidence of tradition, but obviously to the fact that biblical Yahwism was not yet widespread in this period and had little to no historical or sociological impact yet. So in whatever circles of scribes or literati the biblical sources may have originated and transmitted, we just do not know. This means, however, that while these sources must be included as a definite factor in the historical reconstruction of the religious history of Judaism, they should be regarded as what they are, as a still unexplained marginal phenomenon within the history of Yahwism. But the historical reconstruction should not be based on them at all. We should therefore stop pretending that we know more than everybody can, or that can be known. If this is achieved, a great deal would already have been achieved. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Professor Kratz, for a very intriguing lecture, I must say. Questions? Yes, please. No.
Thank you very much for making this very important distinction between the two types of Yahwism over here. I think I would maybe add another distinction between the two. I understand the general argument as being that basically the biblical form of Yahwism should not be privileged. In fact, maybe should be the epigraphic version of Yahwism, at least from a historical perspective, should be the privileged version. But there's another distinction between the two bodies of evidence which I think can't be ignored, which is that the biblical version of Yahwism is the version that has continuity from the First Temple period through the post-biblical period, or starting with Qumran and whereas the other versions of epigraphic Yahwism basically have no prehistory and no post-history. They basically are periods of time, but they're not connected to the biblical version almost at all, and they don't have any continuity afterwards. So, I mean, obviously we don't know a lot about the provenience of the biblical traditions. It's basically off the radar, but unless we basically posit it's kind of like created ex nihilo, and they're basically, then we still have to, I don't know, it seems like there must be some validity even from a historical perspective. Just it would interest me how you would deal with that the longue durée maybe version of it.
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, I would say that also the epigraphic evidence has a history we can follow up, because I mean, even if you take the quite late Hellenistic inscriptions on Mount Gerizim, they follow a formula which you find all over the ancient Near East. So there's a longue durée history behind them. So it is what we would expect from such formulas, at a temple. And they have it now for Yahweh and not for other gods. So and the same is with Elephantine and Al-Yahudu. I mean, they have legal traditions, they follow some legal rules, and there is of course a tradition behind them. And this is also a tradition which connects them to the pre-exilic or pre-diaspora situation, monarchic situation. And as you know, many people think that Elephantine and maybe also Al-Yahuda, but Elephantine was discussed, is the old state of Yahwism and so on, of the northern or southern or whatever coming from a monarchic period. Maybe it is old, yeah, it is quite old. And it shows that this tradition is kept and remains. I just would say this is not only kept because this is an insula there in Elephantine, it was usual. And actually I would be so bold to say it was usual in Judah and Samaria too. It was there too. So Josephus about his Samaritans is not that wrong, I think. You know, so there is a continuity. And there, especially with the epigraphic sources, I see this longue durée because it is also comparable to ancient Near Eastern analogies. And analogy for an historian is the best what he has as an argument. In the case of the biblical sources, they create a history. And they create a history of sin and punishment because of the law of Moses from the Sinai on. And that's their continuity they are creating. And this is, of course, a fictional continuity. That's the myth of this people. And so I would say, actually, yeah, it's a sort of myth of the people and his God. You know, selection, giving the law, and so on. This is their myth. So I think there the continuity is fabricated, but on the other hand, you find a lot of things in the Hebrew Bible you would also find in epigraphic sources, some formulations, some reeds, or whatever, which had entrance into the Hebrew Bible, of course, because that was their culture. They have a longer history and fit also into the epigraphic material as far as we see it. This is how I would see this aspect. But thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much, Reinhard Kratz. So you know that I agree with you on most of the aspects you presented to us. And I just wanted to stress, so it's very important to me and also for you, is that we have to very strictly divide between the historical, archaeological, epigraphical evidence and the biblical evidence. And that, of course, the biblical picture or the biblical authors like somehow shape their or fabricate their own history or identity. So there's just one small remark I want to make, because you perfectly told us that we have different forms of historical Yahwism, which I would call Yahwistic diversity, because we have different forms of an Elephantine in Al-Yahud in Samaria and Judah and so on and so forth. But there's also the same, I think, with the biblical picture. There's not one biblical Israel, and I know from your publications that you are of the same opinion, but I just wanted to stress this for all. To me, there is a big, let's say, a discussion in a way going on, because what is Israel in biblical Israel is discussed. We have, in Ezra and Nehemiah, we have a very close concept of Israel as only the Returnees. And somehow in the Torah, I would say it's a more open concept and so on and so forth. So the question I would have to you is, would you see a sort of correspondence of having like this historical Yahwistic diversity, and on the other hand, you have this plurality in fabricating the idea, composition, whatever, of Israel, that somehow takes into consideration we have many, or does the biblical image of Israel, how it is developed in the end, reflect this Yahwistic diversity at least to some aspects? Like having, is Samaria integrated or not? And tomorrow I will present a case, making a case for Idumea, that may be integrated in their imagination of Israel.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much for this clarification, I have to say. First of all, you're absolutely right. The biblical Yahwism is also a unification which is not legitimate. So it is, of course, very diverse, this biblical Yahwism. There are disputes going on, and especially at the moment when the Torah became a fundamental document you had to keep in a wider sense, and this, I would say, is in the Hasmonean era, started there, you immediately had to start an halakha, because you cannot live that word by word. You have to explain how to do it. So there the halakha continues the dispute which was also going on into the biblical texts, of course. Whether or not the disputes, the inner, let's say, inner biblical always in this in this more pragmatic way. I mean, whether or not this Israel debut, in a time where Israel didn't exist anymore, actually, you know, whether this inner biblical Israel dispute reflects many forms of Yahwism outside this dispute is hard to say. It is hard to say with the question of does Samaria belong to it or not? Certainly. But again, I mean, if you take Ezra 4 and these witnesses, I mean, what do they actually reflect? What is the reality behind that? What time is it, what they reflect? So certainly it has a certain role, but what I think is, what I wouldn't do anymore, which I have done also, is to project the discourse within the Hebrew Bible sources, the Israel discourse, to project this somehow into historical reality. This is, I think, completely naive. Completely naive. And therefore, I avoid also now to, you know, quote this and that. Even if you say, of course there are historical reflections. Nehemiah, coming there, they are trading through the door on Sabbath. Of course, that was reality. But nobody did care, nobody had a problem with it, because it was usual. It is only the book of Nehemiah who makes a problem out of it. The same with the mixed marriages and so on. So it reflects a lot of historical situations, but in a somehow converted and very way. And therefore, I more and more avoid to project conceptions or whatever in this sociological or historical reality, groups discussing this. Tell me what groups are discussing this Israel discourse. This I find quite naive.
So, thank you, Reinhard. That was, as usual, makes one think. But I want to relate actually to the question that Yitzhak Feder asked and maybe suggest a thought, I think, following your path. It seems to me that that other stream, so the non-Torah-centered stream, actually did have continuity. Because, and to me, the natural continuity for that non-Torah-centered stream is apocalypticism. In the apocalyptic literature, of course, it does know the Torah, and it does know the God of Israel as a central God, but it's not centered around the Torah, or at least in the early, not in second Baruch, but in 1 Enoch. It knows the stories of the Torah, but it does not promote the devotion to the Torah or anything. And the interesting thing in this kind of literature is that in their history, they ignore all about Ezra and Nehemiah. They retell the story of Israel, and then after, Nebuchadnezzar, there's 300 years of nothing, and then the community stands up again. So in that respect, that would be the continuation.
Thank you very much. I mean, this depends how you define this apocalyptic literature. And of course, you're right, they know the Torah, they don't mention it, and you know better than I do, this Mosaic and non-Mosaic, Enochic Judaism, so to speak, which is not a Mosaic. Therefore, actually, usually I don't speak about the Torah-centered. I did this here for this conference just to point out what it is about. Therefore, I'm still keeping the term biblical because, and that means Enoch, Baruch, and other apocalypses, I would subsume and see the continuity of biblical, parabiblical literature. Because this literature, whether with Torah or without Torah, is all the time quoting what became the Hebrew Bible. And they are taking the language, they are quoting it all the time. So they live in this tradition of this biblical discourse, whether they now refer to the Torah of Moshe or not, deliberate not. So I wouldn't see the continuity to the epigraphic material, rather to this biblical, but a different, as you said, and Handel said, it is not a unified discourse, but it's a discourse on these sources. I don't see this discourse in the epigraphic material until the Hasmonean and Roman period. There you see also in the garrison inscriptions that Deuteronomy is quoted and so on and so on. In the epitaphs and so inscriptions, you find the biblical verses coming in. But that's only the later Hellenistic and Roman period.
Thank you very much for your enlightening lecture. I do respect your insistence on being rational, but I must say, although I'm in the room, I still sympathize also with those who respect the biblical project, the mainstream idea. And so I just have a few little comments about the way you present it. One is what you call Yahwism and the 5 principles. To me, it sounds more like monotheism, and I don't think the two are identical. I mean, if you take the Elephantina community, they have Yahoo. It's the same as Yahweh, right? It's the same God, so they are Yahwistic in a way.
Yeah,
but they're not exactly monotheistic.
They are.
So once we realize that you're really talking about monotheism, I think that scholars generally are not pretending so much, as you put it, to follow the biblical narrative about the history of religion, because there are many of them who say that Yahwism is a product of the Babylonian exile, maybe, or maybe Hellenistic, or there are all, I don't know too many scholars since Yechezkel Koifman who insist on the biblical notions that much. And finally, the argument from silence. So I'm not an expert on Elephantina, but no, and I still dare to speak next to you. But I just want to ask an innocent question. If the only literary pieces that are found there are Achikar and something about the stone inscription, that means they know nothing of the Torah? They had no copies, nothing. I mean, can you how can we be so certain about it? Not copies, but
allusions
no.
and so on, references,
Yeah.
we would expect. Yeah, of course.
It's a bit strange,
Of
after
course.
all, isn't it?
It's strange, yeah. Yeah, or not. Maybe it's not that strange, actually. I would expect it. Thank you very much, first of all. Thank you very much. And I agree completely with you. This is a rational, a completely and consequent rational argument. And I feel responsible as a scholar to have a rational argument. And in this room of scholars, I would argue rational. I don't want to, I have great respect, personal respect, about the project, as to say, of biblical Yahwism, which actually is the foundation of Judaism, Christianity, and even Islam. So I have great respect for that, and as a believer, I have no problem to read that and believe it. But as a scholar, I have to say, I want to know where it comes from. And actually nobody knows. But we all do pretend to know who is talking about. Now to the second remark, you're absolutely right. Yahwism is not Yahwism. And in Elephantina we have, certainly there is Yahwism. Of course there are Yahwis. What else? But that is what I wanted to stress, is it is a different form of Yahwism than we find in the biblical literature. I agree with you that the term monotheism and the one-sided idea of monotheistic Yahwism, this is actually also a fiction of the 19th century, of the 18th and 19th century, because if you look at Daniel and if you look at the parabiblical text in Enoch and so on, or the wonderful songs for the Shabbat sacrifice of Qumran, we have Elohim a lot in the heaven. Not only one, a lot of Elohim there. besides him, under him, and so a lot singing in the walls, wonderful. So they still exist. So this is true. Monotheism is, I think, a wrong phrase. But if you take the first commandment, you should have only this God and no else, because, and so on. I mean, this is a commandment to say, yeah, there are other gods, but your God is only this one. That's it. And this we have to accept. And the people in Elephantina obviously didn't see that in that way. And others also not. And we find this principle of the first commandment, keeping it strictly, not really in the epigraphic sources. We don't find it. Now, if I may, the last answer to your question, the only literature. I mean, the Argumentum e Silentium, one has to take that very seriously. And I know people who say, and Bezalel would certainly disagree with me, there are people who say, of course they had a Torah scroll in Elephantina, but it got lost when they had to flee or whatever. In fact, my argument is, we have this parallel, for example. Indeed, the only literary pieces are the Achika and the Bisutun. We don't know where they were found, actually, whether in the Jewish community or wherever, whether they read them or not. At least we can say Achika, they knew, he became a Jew, Achika, in Tobit. In the book of Tobit, he is coming back, and there he is part of the Jewish community. He is not a part of community in the Achika older source. So these are the only pieces. But look, there is one piece, and this is the correspondence about the temple. If you compare this with the letters and the correspondence in Esdra 1:6, this is so similar. Also the formulas are very, very similar. That people say, oh look, there we can confirm the historicity of the correspondence in the Bible. The main difference, and I think this is a very important difference, is the biblical texts speak about the God of Israel. If they talk about Judah and Jerusalem, nobody in Elephantina talks about Israel. They quote the Torah when they want to rebuild the temple. In Elephantina, they write to the governors in Samaria and Jehu. They wrote, we don't know, we have no answer, but they wrote to the priests in Jerusalem. But they never mentioned the Torah of Moses as a measure or criterion to rebuild or feast or whatever, And this, I think, is quite remarkable.
Thank you very much. I think part of the problem is your focus upon narrative elements. You are approaching the text of the Torah from a narrative perspective. You're looking for the history, as you yourself said, for the whole conceptual sense of meaning. So take an example, the Cat of Hinnom amulets. So we do have Berit, and we do have Gaal, but of course we do not know what kind of Berit exactly, and what Geula is expected. This could be a Heilsgeschichte, a salvation history, but we don't know. Obviously, we cannot make the connection, but it may be there. So I think the example shows that approaching the evidence from this narrative perspective may be misleading to some extent, and I would propose to approach the biblical text also from a material perspective. So obviously we do have a continuation of history of the Hebrew language. We do have a continuation in terms of literary tradition, compositional techniques, poetic techniques. So we do have continuity there, and at no point in history, I think, at no point in history, I think, we do find the same, what we possibly can date to a certain period within the biblical text in the epigraphic sources. So, for instance, the inscriptions from Jerusalem, they are the older ones. They are not exactly fitting to the language of the Hebrew Bible. So, again, the material aspect may be important here.
Stefan, thank you very much for this. And I think if you take material also in terms of language and genre, and you said poetry, I would add legal phrases, for example. Torah as legal phrases and so on. And other things, also poetology and also, I mean, telling stories. But actually, I mean, yeah, to say that, of course, in all of the Hebrew Bible literature, there is a continuity of the language, also of genres, also of phrases. Phrases, by the way, you can trace back to Ugarit, you know. I mean, you have phrases in Psalms which you find in Ugarit and they come back and so on. Though there is an old tradition, of course, and continuity. But the point is, for me, investigating this is only possible via analogy. And the analogies, historically, in the ancient Near Eastern, show we find a lot in the Hebrew Bible, which fits very well in this whole context, and you can extract and say, this is an old legal tradition, this is an old this and that and that and that phrase. But how is this framed, how it is composed, how it is put also in this sacred history, including Deuteronomy, is somehow unique. And again, we are talking about Yahwism in the Achaemenid period. Our sources there talk about Israel. There was no Israel. The only self-designation I know, you know it better, are the Greek inscriptions from Delos, Israelitoi. These are obviously Sumerians. Yes, it was very reasonable that they call themselves Israelitoi because they speak about the sanctuary in Samaria and not Jerusalem. So that means this material which is integrated in the Hebrew Bible became a new shape, was newly shaped. For example, I mean, this is, and I would say via analysis, you can trace back to some traces of older pre-biblical traditions. This I would agree completely. In the legal tradition, poetic, and also in the narrative tradition. Of course, you can do that. But this is not anymore the significant shape of the biblical sources, especially not of the sources of the Achaemenid period, of the Persian period. That would be my answer. You know?
Okay, thank you very much. Very helpful and very interesting. I have just a question regarding your taxonomy, biblical and non-biblical Judaism. You already mentioned the problem of the anachronism of the category, sure. But I think this is for me not the most important problem. I'm not sure whether this differentiation obscures more than it clarifies, because it introduces a bifurcation in Persian period Judaism, and it somehow opposes two entities that both do not exist. So non-biblical Judaism lumps together Al-Yahudu and Elephantini, and also what we can reconstruct from the archaeological and the epigraphical record, and biblical Judaism is also lumping together out of the Bible into a master narrative that only exists in the reception history of the Bible. So my question would be, would it not better or somehow help more your case if you would get rid of that distinction altogether and simply leave the field open? There are different ways of somehow conceptualizing what we call later on then Judaism. I also am not very happy with the term Yahwism, because this reduces the religion somehow to the relation to the deity that is at the top of the pantheon, or is the only deity. Simply leaving the field open, wouldn't that be somehow more helpful?
Yeah, thank you very much for this recommendation. If you have an alternative, I would be happy to accept it. Because to leave it open, that levels the whole thing and nivelates. And this is exactly the situation we are dealing with in our textbooks and in our publications. The people let it open and say, well, this is all different, yeah, anything goes. And then you put, by the way, Ezra and Nehemiah on the same level as this and that and the Elephantine papyri. And this is nonsense. And therefore, I mean, I sometimes I thought about talking about, like the historians, literary secondary sources and primary sources. But this is also not really helpful and has also the problem that people think, which is wrong, that the primary sources are the better ones and the secondary sources would be the worse sources. This is also nonsense. So if you have a better interpretation, I mean, with the biblical tradition, I would say there is something in it, because it is a fact that a selection of literature became later the Hebrew Bible. And these writings, with a few exceptions only, but even there in Esther and so on, also Kohelet, I mean, these writings are significantly show a phenomenon, namely they are highly self-referential. So they permanently quote each other and so. So this is, with all discourses, with all differences in biblical writings, in the concepts of what is Yahwism, what is religion, what is a cult, and so on and so on. By the way, the cultic situation, the liturgy is another theme we would have to discuss. By all differences in the biblical literature, it signals at least that this literature is somehow related, and it is related, because they wanted to have it related. If you look at the quotations in the prophets, through the prophetic books and so on. And therefore, I find it not that bad. I just only say, well, it's a pragmatic, and it became the Bible, and if people don't accept this, then okay. Then they can put it side by side.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.